Pretty much ever since day one of Overwatch 2, there's been discourse about why there's even a sequel to Overwatch. A lot of players have had a this could have been a balanced patch approach to Overwatch 2 from the start, and have argued that this never needed to be a sequel at all. The big original pitch for Overwatch 2 was that it would be a PvE game separate from the original PvP, but then over time it morphed into a sequel that would have both, then into just a PvP game that would eventually get PvE later, and now it's discourse, and let's just leave it at that because that isn't the topic of this video. But the discussion of why do we even have an Overwatch 2 is a genuinely interesting one to me for a lot of reasons. I've played since day one of Overwatch 1, and recently I was looking at Overwatch and realizing how fundamentally different it is from the game that I bought back in 2016. Not even in a good or bad way, just in terms of how fundamentally unrecognizable so much of the current game would be to someone who was playing on launch day. It got me thinking about whether or not this game still is Overwatch in some, grand philosophical sense. I mean, obviously it's still Overwatch in the literal sense, it still has the name on the box, but is the game we play today still the same game we were playing in 2016? If not, when did it stop being that game? Was it when Overwatch 2 came out? Was it when a certain number of new heroes and new maps were added? Was it after a certain amount of reworks and adjustments to original heroes and maps? So, that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be doing some philosophy about this live service ship of Theseus as it sinks under the weight of poor management and incompetent communication. And maybe we'll learn something along the way. Also, a quick reminder that the July Members' Choice poll is going on right now between these 4 topics. If you're a channel member and you haven't already voted, or you would like to change your vote, you have 3 days from when this video is released to make your choice. And if you're not a channel member but would like to vote on one of these 4 topics, you can snag a monthly membership for $5 a month with the join button below. My members are a huge part of why I can do any of this, and the support is very appreciated. Alright, on to the topic, starting with Part 1, the Ship of Theseus and Overwatch. For those unfamiliar with the Ship of Theseus, I'll explain it briefly here. The legend goes that Theseus, notable for being a boss in Hades, killed the Minotaur, also notable for being a boss in Hades and getting some excellent fan art with Theseus, in order to save some children of Athens, who King Minos had planned to feed to the Minotaur. We do not have time to get into why any of that was happening, because Greek myth is obviously unhinged, but the important bit for our purposes is that after killing the Minotaur and saving the children from King Minos, Theseus transported them to Delos on a ship to save them. Afterwards, it became an annual tradition in Athens to take the same ship on a pilgrimage to Delos in order to honor Apollo, but over time, the boat obviously needed repairs. Like a plank here or there would be replaced, maybe some sails or oars, I don't know what kind of parts the ship needs. However, as more and more of those repairs happened, philosophers started to ask the question, is this thing still the Ship of Theseus? And this thought experiment comes in several versions. The first that we're going to talk about is from Plutarch, a former philosopher and Hunger Games game maker, who wrote, "The ship wherein Theseus and the youth of Athens returned from Crete had 30 oars, and was preserved by Athenians down even to the time of Demetrius Phalereus, where they took away the old planks as they decayed, putting in new and stronger timber in their places. Insomuch that this ship became a standing example among the philosophers for the logical question of things that grow. One side holding that the ship remained the same, the other contending that it was not the same." Basically, Plutarch is asking, is the Ship of Theseus still the same ship even after it's had some, or even all, of its constituent parts replaced one by one over time? This is the relatively simple version of the thought experiment, where you're basically just deciding whether or not the ship maintains some sort of, essence of being Theseus' ship. If the ship is made up of exactly 100 planks, and you replace one plank, I think most people would probably argue that it's still the same ship. But if you replace 51 planks, though, a majority of the ship is now made from parts that the original ship was not. Is it still the Ship of Theseus? Is this affected by the amount of time that passes between each plank being replaced? For example, if all 100 planks were replaced all at once, is it still the Ship of Theseus? What if only one plank was replaced every year? A century later, all 100 original planks are still gone, but is it the same as if they were replaced all at once? Now, before we go any further, I need to emphasize this is a thought experiment. It's philosophy. This isn't something that has a definitive answer. It's meant to help us better understand how we think about the world and grapple with our perceptions of different situations that can be divergent even when observing the same statements of fact. Different people feel differently about the Ship of Theseus because they're meant to. There isn't some sort of inherently correct answer to the question posed by the experiment. Whatever your feelings about the ship or how it's connected to Overwatch in this video, just please keep that in mind, especially if you decide to get in the comments and discuss it with other people. Now, when we're talking about Overwatch, we can look at this in a few different ways. First of all, we might look at a specific hero. Is Mercy today still the same Mercy as on release day in 2016? Her primary fire still heals you, her secondary fire still damage boosts you, and she can pull out a Glock on you if she needs, she can resurrect people, she can fly to targets with Guardian Angel, and she can float with her passive. However, obviously, a lot has still changed about her. In fact, there's no ability in her kit that functions identically today to how it did on release in 2016. Her healing and damage beams have had tweaks on top of now being able to be multi-target because of her ult, which is Valkyrie now instead of Resurrection. Speaking of res, it's now an ability on a cooldown rather than an ultimate, and even little things like her gun or her passive are different than they were on release. The only thing that's really remained consistent is her health pool sitting at 200. Everything else has changed in one way or another. This is true of a lot of the original 21 heroes of Overwatch. All of them have had tweaks here or there to their weapons, abilities, stats, whatever, and then when Overwatch 2 came out, they all got a visual overhaul as well. It'd be easy to say that all 21 of them are just ships of Theseus and move on, but in reality, they're all pretty different situations. Like, Soldier 76, for example, is very similar to what he was on release day in 2016, but literally nothing about Symmetra works the same way it did on release day except for her movement speed. However, we can also look at this in terms of the game as a whole. Overwatch started with 21 heroes in the tank, attack, defense, and support roles without role queue or hero limits in 6v6 matches. But now it has 37 heroes split across just tank, damage, and support with role queue in place in all main modes and 5v5. Overwatch originally launched with 12 maps in the standard game modes, but now there are 24 in rotation, plus another 16 that exist as arcade and workshop exclusive maps. Speaking of game modes, Overwatch originally launched with 4 main modes: Assault, Control, Escort, and Hybrid. Today, however, Assault has been dropped, Push has been added, and a 5th mode called Flashpoint is also about to come out. After everything has changed, is the Overwatch we play today still Overwatch? And I mean, the simple answer to that is, no, it's not, it's Overwatch 2, but I do think that's kind of a cop-out to this question. For one, Overwatch 2 is very much so a continuation of Overwatch 1, as we've established, but for another, we can still ask the same question even if we break it down into both separate games. Is the Overwatch 1 that people were playing on its final day the same game they were playing on its first day? Is the Overwatch 2 that we're playing today still the same game that we were playing on the first day of it? A more interesting dynamic to consider is whether the size of the change itself matters, or if the only thing that matters is the size of the impact on the game. Like, sure, Sombra and Brigitte were both heroes added to the game post-launch, but their impact on the game in terms of meta and balance were wildly different. If we're keeping this an analogy to the ship of Theseus, do both Sombra and Brigitte count as a single plank being added or replaced? Or does Brigitte represent multiple planks because of how big of an impact she had on the meta and how the game existed? Ultimately, the question of the ship of Theseus, as Plutarch presented it, revolves around whether or not a thing continues to be that thing even as it changes. A more existential version of this is that the cells that constitute your body will die and be replaced over time, with a refresh happening roughly every 7 years. Are you still the same you that you were a decade ago? I mean, you're a conscious creature though, presumably, so you can maintain continuity through change. A boat, or a video game, can't. In the case of Overwatch, specifically now with Overwatch 2, it's especially interesting because it's a digital product. It doesn't have a tangible physical form in the same way as a ship, especially since it's something multiple people are supposed to simultaneously have existing copies of. Is my copy of Overwatch the true version? Is yours? Are both of them? Like, who knows? What happens if someone resuscitates an old version of the game, or uses the workshop to rebuild an earlier build? Are any of those Overwatch? And that actually kind of brings us to the next section. Part 2. The Ships of Theseus and Overwatches. The more complicated version of this thought experiment is the one posed by Thomas Hobbes, of Calvin and Hobbes fame, who said, "For if that ship of Theseus, concerning the difference whereof, made by continual reparation and taking out of the old planks and putting in the new, the sophisters of Athens were wont to dispute, were, after all the planks were changed, the same numerical ship it was at the beginning. And if some man had kept the old planks as they were taken out, and by putting them together afterward in the same order, had again made a ship of them, this, without doubt, had also been the same numerical ship with that which was at the beginnings, and so there would have been 2 ships numerically the same, which is absurd." Basically, Hobbes is saying, okay, let's assume that the ship of Theseus remains the ship of Theseus in terms of its true identity even after every single plank is removed. What happens if some random guy somewhere has been secretly collecting all the parts and exactly reassembling the ship? The idea is that this is supposed to create a bit of an interesting dilemma of identity, because now you have 2 ships that are, for all intents and purposes, the ship of Theseus. In a way, it's meant to be looking at the ship of Theseus as both form and matter. The original ship of Theseus is metaphorically the ship of Theseus as it contained the form, but the reconstructed one is literally the ship of Theseus with all the same matter. When it comes to a physical boat, this is mostly hypothetical. Unless you're deliberately trying to disassemble a ship for the purposes of examining this paradox, it's probably not going to work out, especially because the reassembled ship is not the original ship of Theseus anyways. It's a rotted, resuscitated corpse constructed of boards that were damaged in a way that they weren't when the ship was originally built, or conceived as the ship of Theseus in some way. However, we're not just talking about a boat here. We're talking about a digital product that doesn't face those kinds of limitations. In fact, the nature of live service games is almost the opposite of a ship, since it's the constant changes that tend to be what define a version of the game as being the true game. I mean, yes, you and I might both have a copy of Overwatch 2 downloaded to our PCs, creating 2 instances of the same product that are functionally identical in every meaningful or measurable way. But part of what allows us to both say that we own the proper true version is that both of us keep the game updated. I mean, okay, yes, you and I might both have a copy of Overwatch 2 downloaded to our PCs, creating 2 instances of the same product that are functionally identical in every meaningful or measurable way. But part of what allows us to say we both own the proper true version of Overwatch 2 is that we both keep the game updated, as authenticated by Blizzard, who won't let either of us play if we don't have that true version. But what happens if I go on eBay and buy a brand new, unopened, sealed copy of Overwatch 1 from someone? Maybe I'm a collector, maybe I just like wasting money, maybe it's all an elaborate money laundering scheme, who knows? Point of this is that I buy this game and it arrives at my house. I don't think any of us would dispute that the version of Overwatch 2 that's currently available on Battle.net is Overwatch, regardless of like how many copies of it exist in the world, how many downloaded versions exist simultaneously. What about that game I bought from eBay? There is a disc in a case in that box that contains the launch version of Overwatch 1, and my question to you is that still Overwatch? If yes, why? It's not playable in any way, the servers are offline, and even if they were online, Blizzard wouldn't allow you to play the game without installing software that would change the code that's present on that disc. Like, that wouldn't be allowed, you'd have to update it. In fact, let's say this copy is literally the 1.0 release code. Even ignoring the potential for any sort of day one patch that I might not have been aware of, this game was only the true version of Overwatch for literally 2 days. The very first patch recorded on the Overwatch wiki was 1.0.4, which came out on May 26, 2016. In the grand scheme of things, an extremely tiny percentage of the time that people spent playing this game was spent on a copy that exists on this disc, even before you consider that over a dozen characters that are fundamental to many people's experiences of the game aren't on it. Like, is Ana less authentically Overwatch just because she wouldn't be anywhere on this disc, or this version on this disc wouldn't be able to see her, even though she was added less than 2 months later and has been part of the game for almost 7 years at this point? On the flip side, if you're saying no, why? It's literally Overwatch. It is the most original version of Overwatch that exists. Is the ship of Theseus only still the ship of Theseus if it maintains certain characteristics beyond just the shape or the material? Like, does the ship have to be seaworthy enough to make a pilgrimage to Delos, or would it still be the ship of Theseus if no pieces were ever replaced or upgraded, eventually rendering it useless as a boat? What happens if it's still operational, but put in a museum where no one can sail it? Hobbes talked about the paradox created around form and matter being distinct, but in this instance, the disc is the original form and matter of Overwatch. So, like, what other elements are necessary for a game to be considered Overwatch if this isn't? Especially because if this isn't Overwatch, what is? Or let's say, how about a different version of this question? Let's say that I was an avid Overwatch player, downloaded the game on day one on my gaming PC, kept the game updated 24/7 right up until October 2nd of 2022. Since that day, I haven't connected that PC to the internet, and my version of Overwatch 1 is still installed on it. There is no physical copy of this version, this is exclusively digital. Is that still Overwatch? If you felt like the day one physical copy was still Overwatch, is this any different? Or does the version of Overwatch installed on that PC's hard drive still count? Likewise, if you felt that the day one physical copy wasn't still Overwatch today, does it change anything if the game is the final version of Overwatch 1 that existed? But look, that was still ultimately Overwatch 1. What happens if, instead of leaving my PC offline since October 2nd of 2022, I had taken it offline as of October 4th, 2022, right after installing the original release of Overwatch 2? Would that change anything in your mind? After all, it's still equally unplayable software. Without an update, it can't actually be connected to the servers and play online. And yet, it's also still Overwatch 2. Is it still Overwatch even if it's out of date? What happens if it's only been offline since, like, June 12th, meaning that's only a patch or two behind the current game? In practice, again, it's still unplayable. And yet, it's a lot closer to the current version. Would you argue that someone playing the game in early June wasn't playing Overwatch? And that brings us to the final section of this video. Part 3. When was Overwatch Overwatch? Now, we're not talking about when Overwatch was good. There is plenty of debate around that, and frankly, I have seen the quality of that debate. I am not interested in losing brain cells over it. Some of you have some rose-colored glasses and/or clearly weren't around for moth meta, and it shows. But in this discussion, I also want to talk about a third element that I'm sure that there's somebody else who's like discussed or theorized about and had it named after them before, but on the off chance that nobody more famous or more well-remembered than I said it, I want it to be called the Viveros Addendum. When did it first become the ship of Theseus? Was it when it was first built? Was it when Theseus took possession of it? Was it when it was used for the mythical adventure of Theseus against the Minotaur? When was it established as the ship of Theseus? When did it move out of beta and into a proper release? And what's the release date of Ship of Theseus 1.0? After all, if we're going to discuss this topic, we first have to have an established starting point for when it definitively was the Ship of Theseus. I mean, if we don't agree on what was the Ship of Theseus, how can we argue about whether or not it still is the Ship of Theseus? Video games add some extra wrinkles to this because it's not always easy to define when the game was in an original untouched state. Like, okay, there's a definitive final version of Quantum Redshift, the game that I made a video about last month that 5 people saw. This game was finalized, released, and completed. The version of the game that I played for 21 hours for charity last month is a whole game, with no missing parts or other parts that have been added over time or anything. Most video games over time have been like this to some extent, just because of the limitations of technology and hardware of the era, but not always. DLC is the obvious example, and older games still occasionally would get patches or have new versions released if there was a significant enough issue with the old one to justify it. There are also remakes, which are a whole other can of worms. Something like Halo Anniversary is literally built on top of the geometry of Halo Combat Evolved, but anyone with a brain can still identify that these are separate games, these are different in some ways. However, as widespread access to the internet became increasingly common, it made all of this a lot more nebulous. Game developers are now able to put out a game that could be described as being finished, but still make little tweaks to try and, fix bugs or just add extra content, like, I don't know, Stardew Valley. Thanks to a wide variety of industry and economic factors, you also get games like Cyberpunk 2077 that had a definitive release version that nobody would realistically argue was the finished version of the game. It took a lot of patches and updates to get it to a point where it was even playable for a lot of people on a lot of consoles. And what about modding? Like, does that have an impact? A game like Skyrim isn't exactly getting regular patches anymore, at least not, for the original release of the game, but modders are still putting out content for it. And for a lot of players, it's the mods that they're still playing the game for, not the base content. However, these were all kind of tangents for another time. Today, we're talking about Overwatch, and kind of live service games in a broader sense as well. Like, what is Overwatch? When was it authentically Overwatch? With something like the Ship of Theseus itself as, a literal, physical, tangible object, you could draw those lines that I mentioned earlier. Maybe when it was built, or when Theseus took possession, or when it made the mythical journey that are all valid answers to the question of when did this thing become the Ship of Theseus. However, with Overwatch, it's not so simple. For one, obviously, the boat is defined by its relationship to Theseus. Overwatch is a standalone thing that isn't defined by a relationship to a single person. At most, you could argue that Overwatch becomes Overwatch to you once you take possession of it, but I think that's a reach. More importantly, you can define when a boat has reached a completed state. It might not be the state where it becomes the Ship of Theseus, but if you're building a boat, there can come a point where you hammer the last plank into place and say, okay, yep, boat's done. It's finished. It is a completed boat. With a live service game, by definition, there isn't really a finished version of it. It's also distinct from something like, The Witcher 3, which has a definitive core version as well as additional DLC. You could argue that the core game is still finished with or without that DLC, and that those are just optional extra stuff. In Overwatch, the DLC isn't optional. You can't choose to not have the new heroes and maps in your game if you want to keep playing it. If you choose to log into Overwatch today, there's not an option for heroes like Ana or Sombra or Ashe or even Lifeweaver to not be in the game for you the way that there's an option for you to just not buy Blood and Wine. And to me, this is really the most interesting element of the discussion by far, especially since it revolves around concepts that just didn't exist when Plutarch and Hobbes were writing about this stuff. Both of them, in talking about the Ship of Theseus, talk about it as something that has an assumed origin point. It's, 0 point on the graph. Importantly, not only do they make an assumption about the origin point, they take it for granted that there's even the possibility of there being a definitive origin point where the ship is unquestionably the Ship of Theseus that all potential deviations spiderweb out from. In the last section, I talked about whether multiple true versions of Overwatch can exist at once, but here, I think we should flip that. Is any version of Overwatch a true version of Overwatch? Is there a definitive, authentic version of Overwatch that any other instances of Overwatch can be measured up against to see how much of Overwatch they really are? What makes the current patch more or less valid than the patch before it? Or the patch before that, or the patch from a year ago, or the patch from half a decade ago? The game's developers haven't ever tried to argue that the game is finished, that they've, added all the content they intend to add for it to be seen as a completed product, which indicates that all those add-ons shouldn't really be seen as add-ons. They should be seen as part of the game proper, they just got to the party late. They don't want you to look at Lifeweaver, or Ramatra, or Kiriko, or Sojourn, or Junker Queen as being bonus content. They're meant to be perceived as core content that just came out a little bit late. And of course, what happens if two versions of the game exist on live servers at the same time? Back in Overwatch 1, we had the PTR, the public test region, that usually ran parallel to the live game if it was live at all. Was one of those definitively the true version of Overwatch? What happens if a patch from the PTR was, tested starting on January 1st, then it was approved and wholesale copied over exactly as it was to the live servers on February 1st? If the live servers are the authentic version, then do we retroactively acknowledge that the PTR from January was the authentic version while the live version from January wasn't? Or, maybe more interestingly, what about betas? Overwatch 1 was released on May 24th of 2016, but the game was first made playable to BlizzCon attendees on November 7th of 2014, and beta testing began on October 27th, 2015. Overwatch 2 was first playable at BlizzCon 2019, with the first Overwatch 2 beta opening on April 26th, 2022, while Overwatch 1 was still live. This is where the comparison to the Ship of Theseus for this topic kind of falls apart a little bit, because this just isn't how boats work. Your boat doesn't occasionally turn into two boats to do some experimental tests before folding it back into your first boat. So then, what's the deal? How do we decide when Overwatch was Overwatch in terms of being the definitive, true, authentic version? Or maybe is this kind of the inverse of the Ship of Theseus altogether? A live service game is defined by change and evolution over time. By definition, a live service game is only maintaining that core concept and that core identity if it continues to change. It's like if the Ship of Theseus had been built from day one with the premise that in order to continue being Theseus' ship, it needed to have one plank replaced every 60 days. In that scenario, the Ship of Theseus' constituent parts changing over time is a mandatory element of the ship continuing to be the Ship of Theseus, meaning that the form of the ship is deliberately ambivalent to the continuity of the matter it's made of. A live service game, at least in my opinion, probably isn't something that really can be compared to the traditional understanding of the Ship of Theseus because they aren't built to have definitive finished states that can be used to compare to any other iteration or version of the game. The Ship of Theseus thought experiment broadly revolves around the concept of identity persevering through change, but it doesn't really have an allowance for when change is not only inevitable but baked into the identity itself, where there is no static foundation that we can all agree on as being the definitive game the way we can with Ship of Theseus. But again, that's the fun of philosophy. I'm sure there's at least somebody watching this who just completely disagrees with my perspective for any number of reasons. Maybe you think that there is a state of Overwatch that can plausibly be treated as the starting point, or that there's some other flaw with my premises. Thought experiments don't have objective answers, and whether we're talking about the thought experiment described by Plutarch, or the paradox version of it as described by Hobbes, or whatever I spent the last few minutes doing in this final section, they all exist as a way to discuss how we view the world and our relationships to nebulous concepts like identity. Also, selfishly, if I can be a little bit honest with you today, the fun part of making a philosophy video is that even if it's confusing or doesn't necessarily come to a coherent conclusion, I can just say that's the point and walk away, which is really fun to me. I really enjoy that. And with that said, that's going to be the end of this video. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff if you enjoyed. If you want to see more from me, you can catch me on Twitter at @TheViveros, and I also stream a variety of games, including Overwatch, over at twitch.tv/TheViveros. Don't forget to snag your $5 channel membership to vote for one of these 4 topics. The poll will close at midnight Mountain Time on July 10th, so make sure to get it in before then. Lastly, thank you very, very much to my channel members. Insert name here: Minikyu, Olesp, Cage the Orc, Surtur Z, The Afro of Doom, Nballs, Xander K, Gvaz, Kirby PPG, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Indy D, Destiny, Remy, Vamplin, Popsnack, Lenny, Connor, Circo, Damp Weasel, Nature Big Fan, Yoshi of the Wire, and Peggy, CatLover192, Windex the Great, Hermano, Sourdough, Connor M, Wisdom, Hibby, Canera, Marshalis, Burfy Chan, Stickman34, and Scarlight. Whether you're a member, subscriber, or just a viewer, thank you for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.